Good afternoon, everyone. First, before I get started, I want to say apologies for all of the banging and knocking that you might hear. There's construction going on, and I want to get this explanation out to you as soon as possible. And if this banging is not going to stop until like after 6 o'clock tonight. So I apologize, and I'll try to speak clearly and loudly so you can hear me over all this racket. So I've recorded this brief 3 slides for you to go over the expectations for this week's discussion for Module 5. I got a question about it, and then when I started reading the threaded discussions, it's evident to me that we could use a little bit more clarification on what's expected. So let's recall last week. Last week we learned about value-based, right? So value-based outcomes, and what is value-based thinking, and what's value-based healthcare. This week we fast forward and we're looking at leadership styles, and particularly there was an assignment that you guys were supposed to read and think about those leadership and patient outcomes, right? So when you read that article, the authors framed what they did around, they used the structure, process, outcome framework. And so what I wanted you to do, which I could have, or I should have worded a little bit more clearly, the first question was, what have we learned about this way of leadership thinking? This way means structure, process, outcome. What have we learned about structure, process, outcome leadership? And how does this fit within quantum leadership? So what we've learned is that structure, process, outcome leadership is pretty linear. And it doesn't bode well with quantum theory or quantum leadership, because quantum leadership is based on quantum theory in that there's all this chaos going on around us. Okay, so take a look at this chart here where I have the old style of leadership and then quantum leadership, and some of the ways of looking at these constructs of leadership and outcomes. So the old way of leadership used a lot of linear processes, and the most popular was structure, process, and outcome. So remember, you may have seen, or some of your organizations may still use, these fishbone structures that look at, in fishbone structures in terms of problem solving. So they look at the structure, organizational structure, what are the processes that may have led up to something, and then what was the outcome of these processes. Quantum theory takes a more collateral approach. It's relational, leadership is intuitive, problem solving is intuitive, and it's also multi-directional. When we look to find out, didn't want to go there. When we look to find out what's going on, or when we're trying to measure something. So again, remember, it's relational, it's intuitive, and it's multi-directional. And then when we have leadership, in the old way of thinking, there were task-oriented leaders, and then they also, in the article, which I thought was quite interesting, they called them relational task leadership styles. So the task-oriented leadership style, the nurse leader is very much focused on outcome and whatever it takes to get the job done. In the relational task type leadership, the person may consider the feelings of the employees and the employee climate. However, the bottom line is still focused on get the job done. And with quantum leadership, leaders are very relational. meaning that they're not trying to be everybody's friends, but they understand their employees. They understand their strengths and their weaknesses. And so who is the best person for the job? How do I put teams together that will help us move through a problem? These leaders are also visionary. So they're not just looking at, here's an outcome that we have to obtain. They're looking at, okay, there's an outcome we need to obtain, but what is it beyond that? What is it beyond this? So that's really key. And then in the old style of leadership, there are outcomes, and the outcomes are mostly patient related. So these outcomes may have been mortality, safety, falls, infection, if there were complications within the hospital. And so that's what the authors of that manuscript were looking at. So they wanted to look at leadership, nurse satisfaction, and patient outcomes. So again, their outcomes that they were looking at were, the mortality, falls within a hospital fall rate, nosocomial infection rate, patient satisfaction scores, whether or not there were hospital readmissions. And if you consider quantum leadership, those outcomes, so the leader would, what type of leadership or what type of leadership activities or traits would affect the nursing satisfaction, and the nursing satisfaction would be measured in ways other than outcomes. So we would be looking at not only outcomes, but we would look at value. And so what does that mean? Outcomes are part of value. And when we look at value-based, right, we're thinking, am I getting my money's worth? So it's not just hospital readmission, but in quantum leadership, we look at this outcome and we measure value, not by how many times the patient is readmitted. That is important, but why is this patient getting readmitted? What is happening? What's influencing the readmission of this patient? Is it because nurses are not educating the patients the way they should be, or the nurse may actually be educating the patient, providing needed supplies, but then when the patient gets home, there's a disconnect. There's no follow-up. Maybe they don't have the resources that they need to purchase medications, to be able to change wounds like they should be able, like they need to be able to purchase quality food so that their body has the nutrition to continue to heal, or they have nutrition that's going to help them keep their diet in order if they have hypertension or diabetes. So these are some of the ways I want you to think about this, okay? So how do we translate this? And in the next slide, I'll show you how that third part of the question. So with our old style of thinking, and if you look in the article, they have a schematic of the framework that they used, which was structure and then a line directly attached to process and then a line directly attached to outcomes. And quantum leadership says it doesn't necessarily work that way. All of these things don't, flow. Like the leadership may not necessarily determine nurse satisfaction, which may not necessarily determine outcomes. But all of these things together impact value. So, yes, the leadership is a part of value. Nurse satisfaction is a part of value. And those patient outcomes, whether they're in the hospital or in the community, are definitely a part of measuring healthcare value. You might want to draw some arrows that show even deeper relationships from leadership to nursing satisfaction and even leadership directly impacting patient outcomes, and then explain why. You may use a more linear but descriptive diagram like you see in the lower right down here, where leadership affects nursing satisfaction and impacts which leads to value. And then under value, there may be things like patient outcomes, there may be things like, and then specifically, satisfaction, falls rates, um, etc. So this is what I meant by constructing some sort of diagram or a schematic. Now, you might want to, and the reason I said use PowerPoint is because PowerPoint has these really cool, they have smart art. It has a smart art function, and you can look at some of these relational diagrams and plug in what you want. Or you can make your own. You don't have to use PowerPoint. You don't have to use every single article. Read every single article because the authors. So if you look at the article that is in the course on page 714 and 715, or it might be 24 and 25, I can't remember, but there is a table there. And in the first column, it tells you what the patient outcome is that the authors were looking at. It tells you the author of the particular manuscript that they read. The next column is for significance. So it'll say that it increased that outcome, it decreased that outcome, and in S meant that there's no significance. So there wasn't clear evidence that that leadership style did anything or had any impact on that particular outcome. And then on the very last column, you'll see that they have described the type of leadership that was mentioned in the article in the second column. So either it was transactional, it was relational, or it was task. So if you look at basically, I hate to say the old way of thinking, but it really is an old way of leadership thinking, you might say that patient mortality was directly impacted by having a transactional leader. When that's not necessarily the case, right? So there may be other things that are impacting patient mortality. It could be the nurse-staff ratio. It could be better medications. It could be better equipment in the hospital. Policies that have been put in place. And then, but it's a good indicator of value. But when we think about value, when that nurse leader is thinking about value and patient mortality, it's not just whether or not the patient dies in the hospital, but how is that patient's death, outcomes or illness outcomes going to be in general. So that's where the visionary thinking comes in. If I'm looking at mortality, what are some of the things that are impacting mortality? We can do everything we can for a patient, right, who's had an MI and they have a diagnosis of diabetes and hypertension. We have been feeding them well while they've been in the hospital for the past week. They've been monitored. We're taking their blood pressure 3 times a day. And then the patient is discharged home where they can't afford medication. They don't have a way to get fresh food, fruits and vegetables into their home, and there's no one monitoring them. So the visionary leader would need to think outside of that and say, okay, how can we ensure that this patient has proper nutrition when they go home? How can we ensure that this patient has proper monitoring? It could be something as simple as recording their blood pressure with a digital device and having it monitored back to the hospital or to their provider's office or sending someone out to the home. There are a lot of different ways to do this, but we need a visionary leader who uses a quantum leadership framework to be able to figure these problems out so that we can definitely ensure that there's value that in the care that the patient has received. We're measuring value, so value-based care. I hope this helps a little bit in terms of explaining the assignment. If you still have questions, please let me know. For those of you who may have not quite explained the assignment fully or there's pieces missing, please go back in. You have plenty of time. You can modify your posts. And I look forward to reading what you've put out there. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next week in class. Remember, if you still have questions, let me know. Bye-bye.